So let's continue down this path of cult leaders and dictators, and how it is that humans have this ability to control others, not through physical force, which kind of obvious how that happens, but through mind control. And this is as unique on this planet as thinking. It's as unique as language. And of course, humans excel in these. And we also excel in this ability to control others through mind control. And as I pointed out with the Peter Han, the reason this is so unique to modern humans is because if you go back again and look at someone like the Peter Han that very likely represent our hunter-gatherer ancestors, it was really not just impolite, not just taboo, but just something that was not acceptable for one person to influence another person. Part of that, I think, is that they saw through abstract thinking, and they knew that in reality, which they tend to live in reality far more than us modern humans, we think about it more than we live it, and their ability to stay in reality helped them see through the illusion of any one person having control. So again, how do you know when you're in a cult? Well, you know when you're in a cult when you cannot question the beliefs and opinions and views of the person in charge. And if you watched some of those cult specials, if you've watched a couple documentaries on dictators, that seems to really be true in every single case. And this quote has been attributed to various people, but I'll just throw it out there. If you want to know who rules over you, just look for who you are not allowed to criticize. And that's a big hint there too. But what I want to focus on, because that's more a bit of an obvious part to this, what I want to focus on is something that may not be so obvious. And that's our poor ability to really capture what it is, not just that what we're thinking. And I've done some videos on this, that we're very poor at really knowing what we're thinking, but we are exceptionally terrible at knowing what other people are thinking. We only think we know what other people are thinking. But the research of metacognition, and I've hinted at some of this, is showing that no, we are rather terrible at knowing what other people are thinking. And just as an example, there must have been countless times where this or that dictator, say Hitler, for example, was in a room and practically every other person in the room was thinking, this person needs to be taken out of power. But they didn't act on it because they thought they were the only person with that opinion. So when they tried to think what other people were thinking, they totally got it wrong. And of course, it's also true with the cults. So when we look at Mother God from Love Always Wins, and her habit of drinking a gallon of silver a day, someone must have, most of them probably had this insight that we probably shouldn't be doing this, but they thought, well, I'm the only person thinking this, so they were really reluctant to actually bring it up. And so let me give you a couple other examples of how poor we are at knowing what other people are thinking and how that brings real world consequences. And so I often talk about the Thomas theorem, and the Thomas theorem comes from a sociologist who said that things believed to be true can be true in their consequences. And so that's what we're really talking about here. If everyone holds a particular thought, that those thoughts themselves may be absolutely wrong, but they're still capable of making real world changes, and changes in the real world. So let's start off with a story from Collective Illusions. And it was about a scientist who went to study this conservative small town. And on the surface, the persona of the town was such that no one drank, no one gambled, no one smoked. But he had lived there long enough, and that individually, he had actually smoked, gambled, and drank with every single person in the town. So the whole town, there were really two towns. One was this abstract, surface level, everyone thought everyone believed in, where no one drank or smoked or gambled. But then there was the reality of it, where everyone was doing this. They simply thought they were alone in these behaviors. And a couple weeks ago, I saw a pretty funny meme. I was entertained by it about the 80s band U2. And it was something like, no one really liked U2. It was just that everyone thought everyone else liked this band, and that's how they became famous. And I must admit, having my suspicions back in the 80s of that exact possibility. And there's one other story about a family. And I, as two kids and a wife, I've had this experience so often. It's actually pretty amusing looking back, where you end up going to some restaurant and no one individually wanted to go to this restaurant. Everyone just thought everyone else wanted to go to the restaurant. And you're finishing up and you're like, well, I hope everyone had a good time. I didn't want to go here. And everyone actually admits that no one wanted to go there. And so it really gives the power of collective thinking. And mistakenly thinking you knew what other people were thinking, but it brings certain consequences up in reality. And of course, a lot of this goes back to the Hans Christian Andersen, The Emperor Has No Clothes, and I'm sure you're familiar with that story. And in the end, everyone thought they were the only one who could see, who saw the king as naked. Everyone assumed everyone else saw the clothes, and it was a collective illusion. And the interesting thing about that tale is how a child was the one who spoke the truth. And it was a child who pointed out, the king is naked. And of course, once you break that, then everything else falls apart. It's so much easier to break conformity once one other person has done it for you. And of course, in Deadly Dictators, the author brings up, and you we're probably familiar with the idea of peaceful resistance and nonviolent resistance that was so effectively done by people like Gandhi and Martin Luther King, who we could actually characterize as quite spiritual individuals. But it was their ability to question and suspect that the status quo might be off track. And the thing that's interesting about that is how reminiscent all this is of the left and right sides of the brain. Remember, the left brain can spin these outrageous tales, but the right brain, the devil's advocate, keeps it in line up to a point. But when the right brain's offline, and V.S. Ramachandran talks about these stories where people have right brain strokes, and now the left brain, its stories can get as exaggerated and as bizarre and as off the reality path as it desires, and that's exactly what it does. So the left brain, now disconnected from the kind of positive GPS to reality that the right hemisphere tends to be, and now even hallucinate to maintain its stories. And so in one case, a patient's right brain was taken offline by stroke, and V.S. Ramachandran asked, well, point to me with your left hand, which of course is paralyzed, and the patient hallucinates. Her left brain conjures up this story and says, I'm pointing at your nose right now. You can't see it. And so she literally hallucinated to keep her left brain story going. And so when the right brain kicks in, Ramachandran talks about it as a paradigm shift. And we know these kinds of times where we get off the reality path, and maybe you gain a little bit of weight, but you're able to ignore it until one day you look in the mirror, and that's that the right hemisphere, it's got, your story is so far out of line now that the right hemisphere comes in and does a full paradigm shift and updates the left brain. You say, well, I've got to get back to the gym, I've got to change my diet, or maybe it's with smoking. And so the left brain holds its story that I'm a non-smoker, but it's one day you look in your cart and there's, a carton of cigarettes every couple days, and you're chain smoking, and finally that's the right hemisphere has to kick in and update and say, you're a smoker, and you've got to admit this. And we have those moments, these epiphanies, where we suddenly realize something that we've been in denial about. And of course, particularly interesting, and maybe I've talked about this in a couple other videos, where Rama has this ability to activate the right hemisphere, even in patients with stroke. And it's through getting the eyes to move back and forth laterally. And when he does this, patients will actually temporarily update that very strange left brain system. It'll come back online to reality, and the patient will recognize and say, no, I'm paralyzed. I can't move my left hand. But it only lasts for a short time. So we actually know quite a bit about these systems, and we can go into the past, and it's almost like, so again, the balance between the left and right hemispheres. McGilchrist talks about this, how we go in and out. And so sometimes, there are times of blind conformity in culture, but then there are times where skepticism, art flourish, and freedom flourishes. And so we can go back to the time of Copernicus. And this wasn't very long ago. That's what makes it so interesting. And it wasn't very long ago that our species believed that, well, maybe we believed it. We certainly thought everyone believed it, that the Earth was the center of the universe. And Copernicus challenges, but he had to challenge it on his deathbed. So he wrote his book, he published his book on the revolution of the heavenly spheres, which is just this idea we're not the center of the universe. Things revolve around something other than us. And that became such a upsetting, paradigm-shifting idea that the term revolution, which is to revolve around something, now is a phrase we use when we talk about upsetting the status quo. And of course, Galileo was able to prove this. He looked through his telescope. He saw that the moons of Jupiter revolved around Jupiter. So something revolved around something other than us. And of course, he was subject to house arrest. And so what this is getting back to is the power of common sense. And when we use that phrase, common sense, what we're talking about is consciousness. I mean, these sensory experiences I talk about, these are the best ways to challenge what is going on in terms of the left brain stories and keeping them in line. And so people knew when these things were happening. Conscious observation was well aware that the left brain stories were too out of line. But again, it is a difficult thing to break that conformity. But just want to end on one of my favorite Star Trek episodes, and this one was inspired by 1984, and it's called Chain of Command, I believe, where Picard is actually taken prisoner and he's tortured. And the interesting thing about it is, so this Cardassian is torturing him, and it really explicitly shows what's behind mind control, because he promises Picard, he says, look, you can have a life of philosophy and food and freedom, but the thing it's going to cost you is, I want you to tell me that there are 5 lights. And of course, in fact, there are only 4. And so he continues to torture Picard, and Picard comes back every single time. There are 4 lights. And then, of course, is very similar to what happened in 1984. But in the end, it came very, very close. And Picard even talks about how, in the end, again, it's almost like that left brain story. If it's told enough, if it's repeated enough, the left brain comes to believe it. And he says, he escaped, but he's talking to Counselor Troy, and he says, in the end, I actually did see 5 lights.